Well, here we are, quintessential Australian scene. I'm under the wattle. Hopefully you're lucky enough to have wattle near you. The green and gold, the Australian colours. And why am I standing here? Well, very simply, I want to look at a quote. Well, actually a misquote. David Horne wrote The Lucky Country for Some. And that was, I think, in the early 60s. And for decades, over a half a century, people have been talking about Australia as the lucky country, the land of milk and honey. Now, David Horne was correct when he spoke about the lucky country for some. But at public interest before corporate interests, we're interested in making this the lucky country for everybody. Because if there's one sovereign nation state on this planet which should be leading the world as far as living standards are concerned, as far as the struggle against the climate emergency is concerned, and as far as human rights are concerned, it should be Australia. So what's gone so horribly wrong? Well, obviously, dispossessing people who'd lived here for 60,000 years in the most violent manner, and then attempting to assimilate the remnants of that population through some of the most horrific legislation that the world has ever seen was not a good start. And the fact that for over 220 years we have continued to deny dispossession and the colonisation process, and it wasn't until 1992 that the High Court of Australia, through the Mabo decision, recognised that First Nations people had rights in land to law because of their prior occupation of this land, and in certain cases that right to land had not been extinguished through the colonisation process was the beginning. Now obviously we've come a long way since 1992 and we haven't really moved at all. We've come a long way in actually acknowledging what occurred, but we've not really moved forward in terms of making amends, in terms of discussion about a treaty. At the same time, as well as First Nations people not being part of the lucky country, we've also seen over the last 4 decades an acceleration in the inequalities which exist in this country. We've seen an acceleration in the destruction of the social elevator which was created through the struggles of the 19th and 20th century, where working people, through a series of extra-parliamentary actions, strikes, occupations, protests, forced political parties to take on an agenda which recognised that they also had rights, that it wasn't just the squatters, the landed gentry, who had rights. And we saw at the beginning of the 20th century, as far as non-Indigenous Australians were concerned, we saw the introduction of legislation which attempted to use this country's natural resource bounty to provide a decent standard of living for most people. So when Mr. Horne, or Professor Horne, wrote his book, The Lucky Country for Some, he highlighted the fact that this experiment had been derailed. And I think he'd be turning his grave if he realised how far it has been derailed. We find ourselves in 2021 in the most resource-rich country on the planet, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, we are seeing the rich go richer, the powerful grow more powerful, the poor grow poorer, and the middle classes being strangled through debt. Now my friend the birds here are singing away. You know, as long as the wattle's here and the trees are here, they're quite happy. So why shouldn't we as a people be in a position to make this the land of milk and honey and this the lucky country? Because ultimately we only have about 25 million people living on a continent. That's right, not an island, but a continent surrounded by a series of islands which are also inhabited. So why do we find ourselves in this situation in 2021? When you look at all the statistics, we see that although the number of billionaires and millionaires continues to grow, and I'm talking about an exceptionally small fraction of society, we are seeing those who find themselves with no savings, apart from possibly superannuation, no savings, living a day-to-day existence. And it's quite concerning to know that over 40% of Australians would find themselves in financial difficulty if they were faced with some type of crisis, because they've got no financial reserves. So what's happened? What's happened to the dream of creating an egalitarian community? What's happened to the dream of using public education as a social elevator to ensure that everybody had access to education? What's happened to the dream of a fair universal healthcare system? Well, it's been derailed over and over again. Over the last 40 years, we have seen a program to roll back every one of the gains that have been made during the previous 150 years. And these gains have been rolled back through the population at large, taking on the very ideas which make the powerful more powerful and the rich richer. The first one is deregulation. We've seen deregulation reach such a crescendo that we can't even face the idea of doing something about the climate emergency, because agribusiness, and I'm not talking about small farmers, I'm talking about agribusiness, now manipulates the National Party and manipulates the parliamentary agenda as far as land clearing is concerned, as far as many other initiatives is concerned, including irrigation and the Murray-Goulburn. We've got to this situation, Murray-Darling, we've got to the situation where we now face a climate emergency, and people on the land and in regional Australia are beginning to understand what that means is, as far as increasing natural disasters and as far as increasing issues as far as increasing temperatures are concerned. So all the regulations which were put in place to protect the environment, protect the waterways, protect workers, protect those on social security benefits, have been slowly rolled back. And by using derogatory terms like red tape, green tape, black tape, and the list goes on and on. As if a legislative agenda which protects Australians is somehow counterproductive as far as the economy is concerned is ridiculous. And as regulations are removed, we see the ridiculous situations of corporations regulating themselves and paying basically voluntary taxation, while the taxation burden continues to fall on those people earning less than $150,000 a year. So deregulation. Next thing is privatisation. If you're a business person, if you're an investor, this has been the holy grail. This is the holy grail of the privatisation agenda. Moving public assets and placing them in the hands of the private sector. Could you imagine that? Public assets which were created over decades, over a century, to provide essential services for Australians, which were built up by the use of taxpayers' money, has now been virtually given away to the private sector. For example, we find ourselves in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis, which won't go away until there are adequate vaccination levels, and then it'll continue to be part and parcel of the human condition. And we saw the ridiculous situation in the mid-1990s, Paul Keating, a Labor Prime Minister, privatising the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, which had been established as a public sector organisation in 1911 to provide vaccinations for people. Could you imagine that? It was privatised for about $2.75 a share, and you'd be lucky to get any change out of, I think it's about $180 for a share today. And we saw the ridiculous situation of the federal government having to give the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, CSL, which is now a privately owned company, $1 billion to produce a vaccine which has its issues, AstraZeneca. If we had a Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, we could have been at the forefront as a nation because of the excellence of much of the scientific research that goes on in this country. We've seen the privatisation of essential services, gas, electricity, roads in some circumstances, healthcare. We've seen the increasing privatisation of healthcare, public support for a private health insurance industry, and the list goes on and on. The ports have been privatised, the airports have been privatised, the national aircraft carrier has been privatised, certain railway lines have been privatised. Many services within the so-called public hospital sector have been privatised. And we were told that privatisation would reduce prices. Obviously, privatisation has not reduced prices. All it's done is provide increasing profits to private investors who use this country's franking credit laws to augment their share portfolio by siphoning off much needed taxpayers' money. We've seen the increasing privatisation of the education sector, creating a two-tier education system. We've seen more and more public money continue to flow into the private sector. So it's not just a matter of privatising what were public assets which were built up through taxpayers for the blood, sweat and tears of people in the past, but we now see the ridiculous situation of public money pouring into the private sector, whether it's for early childhood development, where billions of dollars now pour into the private education sector, whether it's the nursing home sector. We've seen Royal Commission after Royal Commission highlight how inadequate nursing home services are. We've seen billions of dollars going to the private nursing home sector, private education sector, private health insurance industry, private mining corporations, and the list goes on and on. So we have a problem. Then the next problem, which has been a huge issue, has been corporatisation. Now in this country we don't even have antitrust laws which force corporations to be broken up. In this country we now have 2 or 3 corporations dominating 80 to 90% of specific areas of human activity. And corporatisation has been allowed to occur at the expense of small business. I'm sick and tired of hearing small business people saying they're part and parcel of the capitalist system. Basically, if you're a small business, you're running a handicap race. You're 50 metres behind the corporate sector in a 100 metres race, and the only way you're going to make any money is if you have a start-up which serves as competition, which then the large corporations buy out. So there are issues, and even my friends the birds can, highlight that there are issues as far as corporatisation is concerned. It's strangled and destroyed small business. And corporatisation has had an interesting side effect, and that side effect is the destruction of the trade union movement as a viable force in this country. Now, I love seeing the Commonwealth government jump up and down, the Morrison-led government jump up and down about human rights in China and the fact that they don't have the right to strike. Well, there is no right to strike anymore in this country. It's been legislated out of existence. Legislated out of existence. The only time you can strike is during an enterprise bargaining agreement period after you jump through so many hoops and had the so-called strike rubber stamped by the courts before you can withdraw your labour. If you withdraw your labour in a wildcat strike, you can be fined $10,000 a day, and it has happened. So corporatisation has done all it's been instrumental in destroying the trade union movement, into a significant degree destroying what should have been a viable small business and micro business sector. Then we have globalisation, that wonderful idea that we should all rely on being consumers. We want the cheapest consumer goods in the world. And if that means exporting jobs to countries where people work 12-hour days and receive $3 a day for their efforts, so be it. As long as we can get our cheap television sets and our cheap cooking instruments, and the list goes on and on. Globalisation has been a disaster for this country. We have seen people who have had skills which they developed over decades providing important goods and services to the community being legislated out of the equation, being thrown into an economic black hole. And we've now got to the situation where we rely, wages have become so low in this country that we rely on overseas workers, pre-COVID-19, and overseas workers to come here and do the jobs that Australians refuse to do because the wages are so low and the conditions are so terrible. But the corporate sector continues to demand that we import cheap labour in order to improve their bottom line. So if you think words like deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation are just fancy words with no consequences, they are words which highlight what has happened in this country. This is a lucky country. That our future has been robbed. We robbed the future of First Nations people by refusing to acknowledge the brutality of the colonisation process. We have robbed working people in this country, and we continue to rob them. We continue to allow them to rob us of what should be our country. If you're concerned about the racial origins or the colour of a person's skin who's part of the corporate sector, that's not the issue. The central issue is the fact that we have allowed large corporations to dominate not only the economic activity in this country, but to dominate the parliamentary agenda, ensuring that legislation that does not affect them that affects them never passes through Parliament. We have allowed the corporate sector to set the economic agenda, the cultural agenda, and most importantly of all, the majority of Australians have accepted the fact that globalisation, corporatisation, privatisation and deregulation is essential to create a productive society. It is the essence of we have become what we have become because we have believed the propaganda. We have been seduced by the promise of cheap consumer goods. Cheap consumer goods which we can access through debt, whether it's debt through the new type of payment schemes, whether it's debt through credit cards, whether it's debt through bank loans. It's the same thing. Debt is debt is debt is debt. So why do we find ourselves in this situation in 2021? And we find ourselves in this situation in 2021 because there are no political movements, there are no political parties which are willing to address the central issue which has made Australia the lucky country for some, not the lucky country for everybody. We have enough resources, we have enough skills, we have enough ambition to resolve these issues. But while we continue to accept the fact that a small section of society owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and we allow them to dominate every aspect of our existence and allow them to drown us in debt, nothing will change. If you're sick and tired of what's happening, I suggest you think seriously about joining public interest before corporate interest. Go to the website, PIBCI.net. Haven't got a website? Well, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489. Don't have a phone? You can always send a letter to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Without your support, nothing will change. We are the people we've been waiting for.